And now for the first part of part 4 of Tress of the Emerald Sea. We start with chapter 22. In chapter 22, we find out about the idiot. The next day, Captain Crow woke Tress with a shout. That should have been Tress's first clue that something was odd, as it didn't involve kicking. Crow passed up opportunities to cause physical pain about as often as banks provide free samples. Instead, Crow led Tress through the middle deck to a room with a very large padlock on the door, the type you use to make a statement. You really aren't afraid of spores, girl? Crow said as she counted over the keys on her keyring. I said that I'm afraid, Captain. It's just that lately everything and everyone seems inclined to try to kill me. So I guess spores are simply one more, no more notable than the others. No more notable, Crow said, selecting the correct key. Well, that's an encouraging attitude. Encouraging indeed, my red-coated sprouter. The click of the key in the lock had an ominous tone, the sound of a trap being sprung. Crow removed the key from her ring and handed it to Tress. This will be yours now, girl. Tress looked at it, but had not missed that the ring held a second key identical to this one. Crow pushed through the door, and Tress glanced down the hall to where several Dougs were watching and whispering to one another. When the door opened, they stepped backward. Bracing herself, Tress followed Crow into the room. It did not seem so fearsome as to warrant such a reaction from the Dougs. The small chamber, longer than it was wide, had a single porthole at the end looking out at the sea. Spores churned up from the ship's passing, occasionally rising to cover the window, briefly plunging the room into darkness. It had a bunk on one end that was pure luxury to Tress, with a blanket and a mattress and a pillow. Sure, the mattress looked lumpy and the pillow was small, and the blanket likely hadn't been washed since the invention of vowels, but when you'd been sleeping on the deck, you learn to grade on a curve. Along the wall opposite the bunk was a small work table. Above it sat a set of drawers was built into the wall. Their only other item of note was a large mirror hanging above the table, giving the room an open feeling and revealing to Tress exactly how much of a mess her hair was. It evoked the impression of an eldritch horror escaping from its long slumber to stretch tentacles in all directions, disintegrating realities, seeking the lives of virgins, and demanding a sacrifice of hundreds of bottles of expensive conditioner. Crow stepped over to the door, nestled in the corner, near the head of the bunk. She pulled that open and gestured inside, revealing a stall, barely tall enough to stand up in, with a floor that lowered 2 feet down into a basin, with a drain and a spigot high on the wall. A bath? If this bunk was luxury, the idea of a bath was paradise. We keep a spigot hooked to the barrel filled with water, Crow said. Let us know when you want it refilled. We've always needed a lot of it for his experiments. Experiments? With spores, Crow said, sighing. You'll have to keep up, girl. If you're going to train as our sprouter, anytime you work with spores, do it in this chamber, unless you get specific permission from me. I'd even prefer you fill the Zephyr spore charges for the cannons in here. I understand, Tress said. Be sure you do, Crow said. Your entire chamber is reinforced with aluminum, but there's a silver lining beyond in case something breaks through. Despite all those protections, you could rip my ship apart if you're careless. Tress nodded. You have no idea, do you? Crow said. What you're doing. What will be expected of you? You have no clue how dangerous your job will be. Do you really want to go through with this? Do I get to sleep in that bed? Yes, then I'm in. Crow smiled. It would have been less unnatural to see those shining teeth and curling lips on an actual crow. I'll send Ulam to brief you, but before you grow too fond of your new accommodations, be sure to have a look at the floor. The captain sauntered off, taking a swig from her canteen. Tress sat on the mattress, trying to discern what the captain had meant by that last comment. The floor looked normal, wooden planks, though a little dusty, since it didn't appear that anyone had cleaned the room since Weave's death. As she considered it, that troubled her. Why hadn't anyone claimed this room? A bed, a mirror, and running water? The moment Weave died, the sailor should have been fighting for a chance to... Then it struck her. There was no silver in the floor. She would have seen it sooner if she'd been more experienced with ship life, except for one little section near the cannon. All decks, save the hold of the Crow's song, were insert with silver. This was a fine, expensive merchant vessel. They could even afford some aluminum, which wasn't costly at this point, as it has once been, but it was pricey, and it was built to keep its occupants safe, comfortable, and keep its occupants comfortable and, most importantly, safe. Except in here, where the sprouter needed to work with spores. Tress glanced at the portal and the verdant spores rolling past. Each time the ship surged in the sea and the room would plunged into darkness, her heart sped up a little. Moons! No wonder no one else had wanted the room. You'd have to be insane to sleep here. Huck found her snoring softly a short time later. One shouldn't blame her. Sleeping on the deck really hadn't involved much sleeping. Tress, Huck was... What's this? Your own room? She sat up groggily. Yep. It's a death trap, but a comfortable one. Where have you been? They got a cat, Tress. Huck grumbled, eyeing the door. An actual cat. This is an insult of the gravest kind, as in the kind that leads to my grave. Stick close to me, Tress said. I'll try to keep you away from it. Huck shivered visibly. I hate cats, he whispered. Plus, how stupid do you have to be to get a cat because of one rat? Like, what is going to eat more of your food? Me? Or a thing 10 times my weight? Idiot humans? Or other humans not named Tress. I'm my own brand of idiot, Huck, she said, considering I'm still on this ship. With a sigh, she heaved herself off the bed and went above to fetch her sack of cups. She returned to the room where she began arranging her cups on her work table, thinking of stories Charlie had told her when she'd shown him each one. She felt like a traitor, staying and helping people she barely knew instead of hunting for a way to save him. She whispered prayers to the moons as she arranged the cups and promised herself that she would find a way. If she could help this crew and they weren't willing to take her to the midnight sea in return, maybe they could still help her in some other way, like gathering money for the ransom. That made her feel sick. She didn't want to rob people to save Charlie. In that moment, holding the cup with the butterfly, she acknowledged something. She could never pay a ransom, and she wouldn't resort to piracy to do it. She'd have to find some other way to save Charlie, but how? What could she do? As she was contemplating this, fighting to keep her tears in check, a peppy voice spoke from the doorway. Need a hand? You didn't literally bring me a hand, did you, Ulam? Tress asked. Ulam furtively tucked one arm behind his back. Would it be so crass, Miss Tress? Yes, it's why I asked. The ashen-skinned man, person, thing, grinned and stepped into the room. Behind him, I peeked in, but as Tress didn't have any marmosets, I wasn't interested at the moment. You know about all of this, Doctor? Tress said, waving the small room with the basin and the spigot. The captain said it was for experiments. Yes, we've loved experiments of how can I con everyone else into letting me take warm baths? They kept the water barrel out in the sun. While I doubt your washing will be toasty, you also won't be freezing any bits off. He glanced at her. If you do, be sure and save them for me. Hmm? So, it is a bath, Tress said. Well, we did need a room where he could manipulate spores and sometimes activate them without posing too much danger to the crew. That required a ceramic basin that would hold water. He merely extrapolated. He was a cunning fellow, except that part in the end. Ulam shook his head. What a waste of a corpse. Captain says I'll need to take on some of Weave's duties if I'm going to stay on the ship. Was there more than the work with the Zephyr spores? Oh, you'll want to practice with roseite for sealing breaches in emergencies, Ulam said, and in growing verdant without breaking anything, as the vines can become emergency food. Yes, they are edible. I suppose anything is if you're optimistic enough. I'm optimistic, I said, looking in again. I once ate an entire rock. I had to fight off its family first, though I growled and wandered away. Tress mostly missed what I said, focused as she was on ailments. Do you know what his issue is, doctor? She asked. Boyd has too many issues to count, Ulam said, poking through the drawers above her table. I wouldn't trouble yourself with his situation. He's nearly as deft at untying knots as he is at creating them. She nodded and her eyes and eyed her bunk. When Ulam left, could she take another nap? Or would she be reprimanded for loafing? Yes, Ulam said absently. Boyd should have known better than to tangle with the sorceress. In fact, he probably did know better. Frightening how infrequently he lets that influence what he actually decides to do. Tress felt a start that drove away thoughts of sleep. The sorceress? Hmm? Yes, what did you think happened to him? He puts on a brave front, pretending to just be an ordinary idiot, but I assure you that he's instead the extraordinary kind. Remarkably, really. I always say, when trouble troubles you, keep a stiff upper lip, or several. There's someone on this ship, Tress said, choosing her words carefully, who knows the way to the sorceress, who has been there before and escaped alive. Technically, yes, Ulam said, but I haven't the faintest idea how Hoyt did it. I found him like this after I arrived on the planet in response to his letter. On the planet? She asked. Like, you're from the stars? She'd heard stories of visitors from the stars, had thought them fancies, even if there did seem to be more and more of them these days, talked among the sailors. Ulam said. Oh, yes, not from a star really, but a planet that orbits one. Regardless, I doubt you'll be able to get anything useful out of Hoyd with that curse still in place. She put thoughts of such distant locations and the cups they must have out of her mind for now. There was someone here who could help her find Charlie. Hoyd could be her solution. She felt an enormous sense of relief, then a sudden strike of panic. If she had left the ship, she would never have known. She sat down with a dazed expression, realizing that I was, in fact, the key she needed. She formed a real plan at last, one she could maybe accomplish. Find out from me how to reach the sorceress and perhaps learn how to deal with her. Still a daunting prospect, but it was better than what she had before. And as she sat there, she considered that perhaps this crew and the kindly people on it, trapped in their own kind of prison, were exactly what she needed to save Charlie. And that's the end of chapter 22. Chapter 23. The Assistant Cannon Master. There are 12 C's, Anne explained, as she sat on the railing of the ship, knocking her heels rhythmically on the wood, and therefore 12 kinds of spores. How could you not know that? I lived all my life in a little mining town, Tress explained. Yes, we always talked about there being 12 seas and 12 moons, But I've learned so much in the last few days, I figured I should confirm things like that. She's right to ask, Anne, Fort said, holding up his sign. There are, after all, 13 kinds of spores. No, there ain't, Anne said. Don't you be spreading that lie. It's not a lie, he wrote. It's a legend, different thing entirely. Nonsense is the proper term, Anne said. People can't even make up their minds on what color bone spores are supposed to be, white or black or both. Listen, Tress, there are 12 kinds of spores. Tress nodded. They were at the prow of the ship, on the upper deck, near the forward cannon. Tress hadn't been surprised to find Anne here. The lanky carpenter often hung around the cannon, shooting at glances like a teenager with a crush. However, Tress had been surprised to see Fort sitting on the deck this morning, darning socks. A part of her had believed him a permanent fixture of his office. For her part, Tress was carefully counting the pouches of zephyr spores in the gunnery barrel. She'd asked Laggart, and he'd said they should maintain 40 on hand. She figured that counting them gave her a good excuse to move them out of the barrel into an aluminum box where they'd be safe from the ship's silver. 12 C's, Tress said. How many have you seen, Anne? 3, she said proudly. The Emerald Sea, the Sapphire Sea, and the Rose Sea. Impressive, Fort wrote. I know, isn't it? I've been to 10. What? Anne sat up straight. Liar! Why would I lie? You're literally a pirate, Anne said. Everyone knows you can't trust those types. Fort rolled his eyes expressively, then turned back to his work on his socks. Tress hesitated, looking at her box of pouches. Had that been the 22nd or the 23rd she'd just counted? With a soft groan, she piled them all back again into the barrel and started again. Which two? Anne asked, tapping Fort to make him look up. Which ones haven't you been to? Not hard to guess, Fort wrote. Midnight and Crimson Seas? He nodded. The Midnight Sea, Tress said, as she counted. That's where the sorceress lives. Yep, Anne said, and the Crimson Sea is the domain of the dragon. But that's not why people don't sail them. It's the spores. You need to know this stuff if you're going to be a sprouter. Most types of spores are deadly, but 2 are downright catastrophic. Stay away from crimson spores and midnight spores, all right? All right, Tress said. You have to go through the crimson to get to the midnight, right? So I'm unlikely to ever do that, she frowned. Why do you have to go through one to get to the other? Can't you just sail around the crimson to get to the midnight? Not unless you can sail through several mountain ranges, Anne said. I suppose you could sail all around the world and then come on the midnight from behind. It's one of the reasons the sorceress set up there, Fort explained. She controls trade through the region, the passage that connects the planet. Only her ships can sail the midnight. Been years, Anne noted, since there was any trade, though. The king doesn't want to pay tariffs, and so it's war instead. As if he thinks he can beat her, Fort said, shaking his head. He can't even get a proper fleet through the Crimson. Too dangerous. Tress nodded. These seemed like things she probably should have known already. She was playing catch-up, but for the second time, she was glad she hadn't left these people. She realized that only one member of the crew likely had experience with the sorceress personally, but all of them had information that could help her. There are 25 pouches here, she said, finishing, so I need to make 15 more. Without blowing off your face this time, Anne said. It didn't blow it off. Technically, I'm sure some pieces of it were removed, Anne said. Too bad you got that salve. You'd look badass with a scar or 2 on your face. Tress gave a noncommittal shrug to that. Then, as Anne returned to pestering Fort, Tress quietly undid the latch that opened the false bottom of the barrel and counted 5 hidden cannonballs, each a little larger than her fist. With Huck acting as lookout, she'd retrieved some ordinary ones from the ship's hold. No one to guard them. who would steal them? But now, trying to keep herself from sweating at the subterfuge, she began slipping them from her sack and swapping them for the ones in the barrel's false bottom. She was certain be noticed at any moment, but people rarely watch you as much as you think. They're too busy worrying about whether you're watching them. So Tress was able to, one at a time, replace Laggert's secret cannonballs with ordinary ones. Then she latched the hidden bottom and replaced the 25 Zephyr spores in pouches. The swap performed, she pointedly dried her hands and did not poke at her mask. Anyone can blow their face off by accident. I mean, who hasn't? But if you do it twice in a row, you look really silly. Tress cinched close her stack. Then she still didn't know what she'd do with those sabotage cannonballs. Hide them in her cabin? Drop them off the boat in secret? Hey, Tress, Anne said, when you're making charges, do you think you could maybe whip me up a few extra so I can practice? Don't see why not, Tress said, assuming the captain says it's all right. Yeah, Anne said, of course, though there was something in her tone reminiscent of how you might talk about that project you'd been planning to finish tomorrow. She wandered off, but only after trailing her fingers along the length of the cannon. Fort had been focused on his work and had therefore missed the conversation. While his condition leads to plenty of difficulties, I will say I've always envied his ability to, by looking away, completely excise from his life most of the stupid things people say. Tress settled down on the deck in front of him, catching his attention. What's up with Anne and the cannons? Tress asked. I thought she was the ship's assistant cannon master. Suppose she still is, Fort wrote. Didn't ever officially get removed from the post. She won't be firing guns anytime soon, though. Tress caught. What did she do? She whispered, leaning in. Are you whispering? Fort wrote back. Yes. That's cute. Anne, are you going to tell me about her or no? What will you trade me for the information? Do we have to negotiate every time, Fort? Tress asked. Can't we just chat like friends? But the negotiation is the fun part, he wrote. It's what tells me about you. What are you willing to give up? What do you value? Come on. Doesn't it excite you to try to find the best deal? I don't really know. What will you tell me to get me to talk about Anne? Information for information. You're distracting me from repairing these socks, you know. I can't sew and watch the board at the same time, so you owe me. But I don't know anything interesting to trade. Oh, and why are you here? What's possessed a nice girl from a small town to steal an inspector's coat and go out pretending to be a pirate? She leaned in, speaking softly, despite what he'd said before. My ignorance is that obvious? Girl, if you'd been sailing the Spore Sea for longer than a week before we found you, I'll eat my own cooking. So why are you out here? I'm looking for someone, she said, someone dear to me. Ah, Fort wrote, so you're searching the seas like Sally, hoping that at each new port you'll find the sock that he deleted that part of the story. Sorry, Board isn't always good at predicting. You're hoping to find that person you've lost. Tress glanced across the ship toward the helmswoman, who stood as sturdy as the masts, fixed in place on her quarterdeck, both hands gripping the ship's wheel. As usual, her dark eyes were fixed on the horizon with the kind of intense expression people reserved for only the most important of tasks, like finding the last piece of unopened candy in a bag full of wrappers. She hunted relentlessly for her father. In the face of Saleh's confident determination, Tress's own quest seemed laughable. It's not really the same, Tress told Fort. Saleh has no idea where she'll find her father. I know exactly where Charlie is. Fort nudged her a moment later. Oh, he'd written. Just need to save up some money to get him then. It's worse than that, I'm afraid, she said. Sorceress has him. attacked his ship, took him captive. Fort's shoulders slumped. Oh, he wrote, I'm sorry. Yeah, I barely have any idea what I'm doing. Fort, but I do have to reach him. She grimaced. I said I'll likely never reach the midnight. That was kind of a lie. I'm determined to get there, somehow. If the sorceress attacked his ship, he's dead. I'm sorry. You should probably move on. He's alive, Tress said. She asked for a ransom from the king to free Charlie. I thought maybe I could make enough money to convince the king to pay it. Tress, Fort wrote, the sorceress doesn't ask for money as ransom. She asks for souls, usually from the royal bloodline. Mere money would never satisfy her. Tress blushed, feeling like an utter lunatic. She'd already realized she wouldn't be able to pay his way free, but still the depth of her ignorance was disturbing. Like a fish trying very hard to jump out of its tank in order to escape, she'd been trying to solve a problem before stopping to wonder if she even understood her situation. Look, if this Charlie was kept for ransom, he's likely a nobleman, right? Yes, Tress whispered. That lot don't care about people like us, Fort wrote. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. You'd best move on. Maybe, Tress said. Well, you gave me information, only fair I give you what you wanted. I can tell you about Anne. I didn't tell you anything important for it, Tress said. You don't have to take that in trade. Ah, Buddy wrote, but the information about Anne is barely worth anything. Everyone knows it. You'd have found out soon anyway. You acted like it was some big secret, Tress said. Nope, just asked what you wanted to trade. He grinned, poking at her arm with a knuckle, and then continued writing. Don't look indignant. Revealing your emotions makes it easier for people to get a good deal out of you. That one is free. Anne was given the job of assistant cannon master because she asked for it after the last one died. But no one thought to have her fire one of the blasted things first. And? Tress asked. That woman has worse aim than a drunk man riding a three-legged llama, Fort wrote. She once fired a pistol at a target, but managed to nearly hit me, and I was standing next to her. The first time she manned the cannon, her aim was so far off, the only thing not in danger was her target. Moans, Tress said. Maybe she just needs more practice. I'll let you teach her then. I'll be safely boarded up in my room, maybe with some armor on. Fort eyed her. Some things aren't meant to be, girl. Sometimes you simply have to accept that. You're talking about me and Charlie. Maybe. Listen, Tress, even if he's still alive, the sorceress will have cursed him like poor old Hoyd. She uses a lot of different types, but she's always puts one on her captives to keep them pliable. How do you know so much about it? Tress asked. Captain told me, Ford explained, when she had me trade to get Hoyd on our ship. The captain specifically wanted Hoyd on the ship? Tress asked. Why? Don't know. She heard about his curse and his trip to the sorceress. Getting him was a poor deal since his former shipmates were happy to be rid of him. Captain insisted, though. Fort shook his head, considering the damage to his reputation once people found out how much he'd traded to get a lunatic to be their cabin boy. Tress' interest deepened, however. Captain Crow had manipulated the crew into becoming pirates and then forced them to become dead runners because she wanted them to sail dangerous seas. And she'd specifically been watching for someone cursed by the sorceress? Maybe? Could the captain be looking to visit the sorceress herself? Tress looked toward Crow, and then Tress took a singular step that separated her from people in most stories. The act, it might be said, that defined her as a hero. She did something so incredible I can barely express its majesty. I should consider this more, Tress thought to herself, and not jump to conclusions. And that's the end. of chapter 23. Chapter 24. The Cursed Man. Perhaps you are confused at why I should your humble storyteller, would make such a fuss about this. Tress stopped, wondered if she'd jumped to a conclusion, and then decided to reconsider. Nothing special, right? Wrong. So very soul crushingly wrong. World bringers like myself spend decades combing through folk tales, legends, myths, histories, and drunken bar songs looking for the most unique stories. We hunt for bravery, cleverness, heroism, and we find no shortage of such virtues. Legends are silly with them. But the person who's willing to reconsider their assumptions, the hero who can sit down and reevaluate their life, well, now that is a gemstone that truly glitters, friend. Perhaps you would prefer a story about someone facing a dragon. Well, this isn't that kind of story, which makes it even more remarkable that Tress does that eventually. But kindly stop getting ahead of me. I can understand why you would want tales of people like Linji, who tried to sail around the world with no aviar. I, however, would trade a dozen Linjis for one person who was willing to sit down for a single blasted minute and think about what they're doing. Do you know how many wars could have been prevented if just one person in charge had stopped to think, maybe we should double check. Perhaps blinking twice isn't an insult in their culture. Do you know how many grand romances would have been could have avoided tragedy if the hero had thought, maybe I should ask her if she likes me first. Do you know how many protracted adventures might have been shortened if the heroine had stopped to wonder, maybe I should look extra carefully to see if the thing I'm searching for has been with me the entire time? I'm drowning in bravery, cleverness, and heroism. Instead, kindly give me just a little common sense. At that moment, Tress was downright majestic. I need more information, Tress thought. Before I decide that I know what the captain's plan is, I need to find a way to spy on her. Maybe I can use Huck again. She nodded, and in that moment, Tress saved herself a huge amount of trouble. The captain's plan had nothing to do with the sorceress after all, but everything to do with why the crew were so frightened of her. Tress picked up her sack, pretending it wasn't full of cannonballs, which was as hard as it sounded, and carried it to the aft cannon, which was set up on the quarterdeck. She performed a similar swap there, placing the cannonball she took into a separate bag within her larger one, while counting Zephyr Spore charges. Then she hauled her bag below decks where she stowed it in her room. From there, she went looking for me. Now, normally this also would have been a shining example of common sense on her part. Everyone can use a little more wit in their lives, except me. I could stand to lose a pound or two. Unfortunately, I wasn't exactly in the best state of mind during this voyage. She found me playing cards with a group of the Dugs. I was wearing a shoe around my neck, tied by the laces, as I decided it was certain to be the absolute soul of fashion in the following season. I'd forgotten to wear pants, as one does, and my underclothing needed a good washing. Actually, all of me did. I was trying to play a game I'd invented called Kings, where everyone held their cards backwards, so you didn't know what you had, but everyone else did. I can imagine several interesting applications now, but back then, the only interesting part was how easily the Dugs won my wages off of me, followed by my shoe. I still have no idea what I did with the other one. Once the Dugs were finished taking me for what little I was worth, they scrambled off to find some other victim. I sat there wondering if perhaps I should start wearing a sock around my neck until Tress settled down beside me. Would you like to play Kings? I asked with a grin. I still have some undershirts I can bet. No thanks, Tress said. Hoyt, I know you visited the sorceress. Do you remember anything about it? Yep, I said. Great. What can you tell me? Can't, I said, tapping my head. Words don't work that way, kiddo. She makes them something else. I don't understand, Tress said. Neither do I replied. That's the problem. Can't say anything at all about what you might think. It's I shrugged, unable to form the word. Your curse forbids you to talk from talking about your curse, Tress guessed. I winked, mostly because I had something in my eye, but in this case, Tress had guessed correctly. The sorceress was quite specific with each bees. If you tried to talk about it, you'd stutter or the words would die halfway out of your lips. You couldn't even tell people you were cursed unless they already knew. So, Tress said, if I want you to lead me to the sorceress, I have to find a way to break your curse without knowing anything about it. Plus, I have to do that without any help from you whatsoever. I took her hands in mine. I looked into her eyes. I took a deep breath, trembling. I once ate an entire watermelon in one sitting, I told her, and it gave me diarrhea. Tress sighed, pulling her hands free. Right, right. I guess finding a way to break your curse is slightly less impossible than finding my way to the sorceress on my own. That's something, at least. There was still a part of me deep down that knew what was going on. The sorceress was cruel like that. Sure, turning a man into a simpleton is fun, but true torture lies in letting him remain just aware enough to be horrified. That sensate part of me scrambled to find some way to help. Ulam had been useless, of course. That's the problem with immortals. They get used to sitting around waiting for problems to work themselves out. But here was someone willing to help. What could I say? What could I do? Only a sliver of me was still awake, and it had almost no control. Plus, every time I tried to say anything about my specific predicament, the curse would activate, driving me back and prompting me to do something monstrous, like wear socks with sandals. That glimmer of awareness started to fade, and I seized upon that, my own stupidity, the curse, like many magics of its ilk, depending on how the subject thought, on their intent. I could use that. I knew. The spark flared up like a midnight fire as the coals shifted. I reached toward Tress and blanked my mind as I forced out a string of words. Listen, this is important, I said. I promise you must bring me to your planet, Tress. Repeat that. Bring you to my planet? Yes, yes. If I can save you if you do that. But you're already here. Hear what? I said, having deliberately forgotten what I'd said. Planets don't matter for now. Look for a group of 6 stars, Tress. Tress hesitated. 6 stars? Unfortunately, in that exclamation, my strength was spent. I sat back, adopted a goofy grin, and decided to do some empirical research regarding the flavors of different toads. With a sigh, Tress returned to her quarters. She left the door open for Huck, and so wasn't surprised when she arrived and found whimpering. She burst into the room to find the ship's cat, Knox, crouched and staring under the bed, tail wagging. Tress threw the thing out the door and slammed it, and in the silence that followed, she could distinctly make out the sounds of a hyperventilating rat. Huck? She asked, getting down on her hands and knees, peering beneath the bed. She made him out in the corner, squeezed him into the space between the wood of the bed's leg and the wall. As he saw her, he came timidly toward her, and she scooped him up, feeling him tremble in her hands. It's gone, she said. I'm sorry, Huck. He didn't speak, a rare occasion where he seemed completely without breath or words. He just cringed there in her hands, looking more, well, like a rat than he ever had before. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. Perhaps you can leave the door locked from now on? There's a crack in the floor, and I can squeeze in that way after climbing up the post in the hallway below. All right, Tress said. Are you going to be okay? Huck glanced at the door. Yeah, sure, he whispered. Give me a little time. Still can't believe they got a cat. You're intelligent, Huck, Tress said. You can handle a common cat. Sure, yeah, no problem, Tress. I don't know. It's always watching, prowling. Cats are supposed to sleep 26 hours a day. How can I use my intelligence? How can I plan knowing it's watching? After a few minutes, he seemed to relax. He nodded to her, so she set him on the footboard, then lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, which was the upper deck of the ship. She could hear sailors crossing it, feet thumping, wood creaking as the ship rocked. Spores made of constant, low, hushed sound as they scraped past, like a whisper. Someone had carved parts of the ceiling with a knife, crude little patterns of crossing lines. I hope your day is better than mine, Huck said, perched on the footboard of the bed. The entire thing had a nice railing to keep her from rolling out as the ship swayed. It's been somewhat frustrating, Tress said, but not life-threatening. What she wanted wasn't nearly so important as what she needed, and she felt guilty for focusing on herself. Your problem with the cat is more pressing. Maybe we could keep it extra well-fed so it doesn't want to hunt you? Cats don't stop hunting because they're full, Tress. They're like people in that regard. Sorry, she said. We don't have cats on the rock. Sounds like a wonderful place. It was sweet and tranquil, she said. And though the smog above town is pretty terrible, people tend to treat one another well. It's a good place, an honest place. I'd like to go there someday. I know you're thirsty for adventure, but I've had plenty. You could go, Tress said. You don't need to stay with me, Huck. Tired of me already? What? She said, setting up. That's not what I meant. You're too polite, girl, he said, twitching his nose. I'll assume that you know less about rats than you do about cats. Try to imagine what it's like to be roughly the size of a sandwich and have most of the world consider you as tasty as one. Trust me, you don't want what I have, which is find a sympathetic human and stick close to them, Huck said. Besides, I have a good feeling about you, remember? But you've got to have family somewhere. Yeah, but they don't care much for me, he said. Are they like you? You mean, can they talk? Huck said. Yes, he paused for his head cocked as if searching for the right way to explain. I come from a place a lot like the one you came from. My kind has lived there for generations. But my kin, they thought it was time to go, see the world. They dragged me off for my own good. That didn't go well. They wouldn't much like me hanging around with you. I'm not supposed to talk to your kind. See, still, like I said, I've got a good feeling about you, and so I'm staying close. But I certainly wouldn't mind if you decided of your own free will to head someplace less exciting. Tress tried to imagine it, a land full of talking rats. It sounded exotic and interesting. The 12 Seas were a strange and incredible place full of wonders. Huck kept talking, telling her about life as a rat, and there was a calming sense into his voice. It soothed her, and she found herself relaxing, her eyes tracking the carvings on the ceiling. Someone, perhaps her predecessor, had taken a lot of time to carve them. In fact, did those bursts of crossing lines look like stars? Tress sat up, cutting off Huck. He scampered along the bed, railing over to beside her. What? Stars, carved in little bursts, a single star there, then 2 stars close together next to it, then 3, all across the wood on the ceiling, as if someone had stood on the bed with a knife and used a point to scrape them. No groupings of 6 stars, she thought. What? Huck said. What are you staring at? Nothing, Tress said, flopping back down. I thought for a moment that Hoyt had said something important. You've been listening to him? Tress thought, I thought you were smart for a human. Hoyt is, you know. He said something about 6 stars, Tress said, but there are no bunches of 6. I can see that, Huck said. I told you he's a lunatic, Tress. No use in trying to figure out what he means. I suppose, she said. Besides, Huck noted, those look more like explosions. The stars are under the bed. Tress froze and then leaped off the bed and pulled herself underneath. The bottom of the bed frame was carved as well, with patterns that were indeed more star-like. There was one patch of 6 stars. Feeling like she might be submitting to lunacy herself, Tress pushed it. Something clicked, and a small latch opened on the other side of the frame. Inside, Tress found a small aluminum container the size of a matchbox. Huck climbed onto her shoulder as she pushed it open. And in it, she found midnight black spores. And that's the end of chapter 25. I meant chapter 24. This is chapter 25. The prey. So, how did I know? Well, I believe you've been told. I'm an expert at being places I'm not supposed to be. I have an innate sixth sense for mystery. In my current state, I might have thought the vests with no shirt underneath to be the absolute height of fashion, but I was still fully capable of a little constructive snooping. Tress's breath caught. Huck hissed softly. Midnight spores. Somehow Weave had gotten a hold of midnight spores. She was reminded of what the captain had said, that all sprouters were to one extent or another crazy. Weave, she thought, might have been a little extra so. Tress was being generous. I'd have called him crazier than a nitroglycerin smoothie. Put those away, Huck said. No better spread over them. Better spread them over silver. Kill them. Tress, midnight spores are dangerous. In what way? She asked. What do they do? Terrible things. All spores do terrible things, Tress said. What do these do specifically? I don't know, Huck admitted, but I feel like you're way too relaxed about holding them. Perhaps she was, but danger is like icy water. You can get used to it if you take it slowly. She tucked the little box of spores safely back in its hidden compartment. She'd have to see if Ulam knew. She jumped as the bell rang up above. 3 quick peals, a warning to everyone on board. A ship had been spotted in the distance, and the captain had decided to pursue. Tress scrambled out of her room, but then stood in the hallway, not wanting to crowd the Duggs as they hastened to the top deck. It was excruciating to wait, and she didn't want to miss anything. She needn't have worried. When she finally reached the deck, she found the Duggs clustered anxiously near the railing, looking out at a distant ship. As usual, the crow's song flew a royal merchant's flag. They wouldn't announce their pirate nature until the proper dramatic moment. Like the third act twist of a play, only with the added bonus of grand larceny. What followed was an extended chase that took 5 hours. The crow's song was faster than most ships, particularly after it dropped the ballast it used to sit lower in the spores, mimicking a merchant ship fully laden with goods in the hold. But speed is a relative term at sea, particularly the spore sea, when the seethe could stop or start at any moment. Tress hadn't realized how unusual it had been for her first vessel to be caught by surprise. The second pursuit required exacting work from the crew and the helmswoman, who slowly but surely ran down their prey. The hours made Tress's tension mount. This was it, the final test of her plan to swap the cannonballs. She grew increasingly certain she had failed. Surely someone had discovered what she'd done. Surely she wasn't clever enough to trick seasoned killers like Laggart and the captain. Her heart nearly leapt from her chest when Crow shouted the order. Forward cannon to bear! All sailors, take arms! The Duggs ran for their muskets, though the ship they were chasing was still far away. Tress didn't try to arm herself. Considering how she'd fired a musket precisely 0 times in her life, she figured the best way to keep her digits attached was to continue that perfect record. She did, however, position herself near the prow, where she could witness Anne begging Laggart to let her have the first shot. He chewed her out and sent her to stand with the others, where one of the Dougs pointedly took the pistol from her hand and put a cutlass in it instead. Anne had another pistol out a moment later, slipped from her holster on the back of her belt. "Warning shot, cannon master!" Crow shouted. Tress held her breath. Laggert swiveled the cannon with a crank, then sighted with his spyglass before using another level to raise the cannon's barrel a few inches. He continued this process, exacting the precise, making adjustments. Finally, he pulled a wet firing stick from the bucket of water at his station. He touched it to the firing pin, setting off the zephyr spores with a raucous explosion. The ball soared directly at the fleeing ship. There was no warning shot. This would be another accidental direct hit, intended to sink, not frighten. Tress heard Anne mutter nearby as she watched the cannonball's trajectory. Tress steeled herself, her panic mounting as she thought of the poor sailors on that ship. Then, with what seemed like only moments to spare, the cannonball exploded, set to detonate like a mortar. It sprayed water across the side of the prey ship, but left the hull unharmed. The sea's response was, of course, immediate. Enormous tentacles of vines erupted from the spore sea, wrapped around the wet side of the ship, gripping the vessel in its deadly embrace. Even from a distance, Tress was certain she could hear the planks groaning, but the ship's hull did not crack. The precision shot immobilized the ship instead of destroying it. Though the crew cheered, this meant easy plunder. Laggert cursed softly, his face growing red. The shade of a forge, the moment before you remove the iron, and produced to lay it into it with everything you have, proceeded to lay into it with everything you have. Captain Crow marched across the deck to the cannon station. Her glare would have skinned a cat, but out loud she said, "Not exactly what I would call a warning shot, cannon master, but that was a very clean capture." "Thank you, Captain," Laggert said. "I apologize for failing in your request." He punctuated each syllable as if he were whipping the sounds for coming from his lips. Tress nearly started hyperventilating from the anxiety. Was Laggert looking at her with a more surly than normal expression? Did he know? If he only suspected foul play, there was only one rational culprit. The captain seemed like she wanted to order another shot, but then she glanced at the cheering Dougs. Even in the twisted lump of smoldering coal that was her heart, Crow understood she needed good morale on her vessel. A quick and easy haul here would accomplish that. "Run up the pirate's flag, Seaman Doug," she said. In response, their prey fired a flare bright in the air. "Surrender." The Dougs cheered again. Tress started to calm down. It was working. Unfortunately, as the Crow's song drew close to the captive ship, the seas stilled. The Crow's song lurched to a halt, and this instantly dampened everyone's enthusiasm. Tress looked at the Dougs, worried. What was the problem? There were interruptions like this every day. "Anne," Tress said, sidling up to her, "what's wrong?" "The ship surrendered," Anne said, her voice tense, "'cause they knew they were beaten. With them held by vines, we could maneuver, and they could not. But now we're both of us stuck. The sea just evened this match, and they got to be asking if maybe they shouldn't just—" She trailed off as a blue puff of zephyr spore rose from the other ship's aft, followed by a crack, followed by a whistle and a crash as a cannonball hit the Crow's song right at the prow where the spores met wood. Chapter 26. The Dougs shouted and went scrambling. Anne cursed something incredibly vile, relating to what comes out of the business end of a seagull. "Damn fine shooting," Laggert muttered. "Hit us first shot. They've got quite the cannon master." Crow shoved aside a few Dougs, then calmly raised her weapon. It looked sleeker than the other muskets the Dougs carried and had a different sight. Though the Crow's song had shortened the distance to the other ship, Tress was still amazed as the captain trained her musket toward the enemy, closed one eye, and fired. A man on the distant ship The one holding the water firing stick as his assistants reloaded the cannon dropped in a spray of blood. Well, Lagert said, I guess they had a damn fine cannon, master. Carpenter and Sprouter, the captain said loudly as she lowered the musket and began to reload, dropping a small pouch of zephyr spores down the muzzle. We've been hit. When the seethe comes again, we'll scoop up half the sea and everyone on this ship will find out what spores taste like. Perhaps you'd like to do your jobs and prevent that? Right, Captain, Anne said, raising her pistol. Let me just get off one more shot before at least a half dozen Dougs grabbed her arm, rustling for the pistol. The captain ignored them, sighting once again, then dropped the sailor who'd been hefting the cannonball to load into the enemy's cannon. It was the best shooting Tress had ever seen. It was the only shooting, granted. Nevertheless, I'll admit Crow was one of the best shots I'd ever seen. And considering that primitive muskets handled like a snake being electrocuted, that is saying something. To work, Anne, the captain said, calm, yet somehow threatening, ice crushing in her voice, or my next shot won't have to travel to another ship. Moon shadows, Anne said, stumbling over Tress. Those Dougs really wanted a chance to use my pistol, eh? Well, let's be on with the captain's order. Stop delaying, Tress. She scrambled below decks, Tress following. You have your tools? Anne asked as they reached the middle deck. What tools? Tress asked. Anne, I only became ship sprouter this morning. I have no idea what I'm doing. Right, Anne said, wiping her brow. Okay. Above, a cannon shot sounded from their ship. We need rose spores. There should be a whole bunch of them in Weave's room. Tress nodded. She leaned to Anne, led Anne to the room, though the carpenter hesitated at the threshold. Tress continued inside, then pried off the top of a small barrel full of rose spores. Get some of those, Anne said, and put them in one of the metal boxes, the kind you can transport spores in. Yeah, that. I saw Weave use some other equipment, too. I don't really know a lot about this kid. Tress finished filling the metal box with spores. Then she pulled open the closet, revealing an array of metal tools hanging from pegs on the inside of the door. She didn't see anything like the box the Sprouter had used on the other ship. Weave, it should be noted, was a purist. He preferred the classical tools of the trade, not the modern ones. Any of these look right? Tress asked. Oh, Anne said, the one with the flat side like a plate and the trowel. Grab those. The second tool did indeed look like a small shovel, but the first one looked like less like a plate to Tress and more like a shield. A little round shield flat on the front with a handle on the back to hold it. The tools had clips on them from hanging from the belt, but there wasn't time for that. Tress gathered them up along with the spores and an eyedropper bottle of water and stumbled out to meet Anne, who backed away, hands up. Righty-o, Anne said. Normally I'd let the Sprouter handle the initial patch while I gathered lumber, but I think maybe you could use a little help, eh? Thanks, Tress said, letting Anne lead the way down the hold. Bright sunlight bathed the normally dim confines, shining through the hole near the ceiling. The hold was taller than the other decks, putting the hole some 9 feet up in the air. I'll get a ladder, Anne said. So what you need to do is grow some spores in that hole, and it don't have to be pretty. I'll do the pretty part with the wood over the next few days. We just need the hole filled. Rosite is good at resisting silver and can last quite a while once it's in place. So it makes a great plug, assuming, you don't kill yourself first. Any advice on avoiding that last part? Tress asked, her voice growing more shrill. Which I did, kid. Those are all the right 2 tools, but I've stayed real far away whenever Weave broke out the spores. That guy was nuttier than squirrel droppings, no offense. Anne set up with a ladder, then backed away. She didn't offer any further help, but Tress was thankful nonetheless. She climbed to the top of the ladder and looked out the ocean of spores. At that moment, they were calm, flat, stable. But the instant the seethe started, the ship would move forward and the verdant spores would come flooding through the gap. Even if the hold had a silver lining, the ship would quickly take on way too much weight and stop floating. Tress didn't hear any more shots from above. She pretended that was a good sign, and she set her equipment on a nearby shelf for sacks. Last of all, she opened the aluminum box of spores. They looked like grains of pink salt. Trembling, she tipped the box until a few of them dribbled out onto the edge of the broken wood. Unfortunately, by the time she had the dropper open and the water ready to squirt, the spores had turned dark gray, dead from the silver on the deck just above. Feeling stupid, she closed the box, but not before a number of those inside had died also. She took a few deep breaths, then forcing herself to keep trying, she put some water on the wood first, then opened the box. Leaning back and shielding her face, she sprinkled a few spores onto the water. It was a commendable execution of a terrible plan. The rose spores broke into thick roseite crystals like big chunks of quartz. While they weren't sharp, some broke up into the ceiling and another shot diagonally past Tress's head, nearly smashing her in the face. It didn't plug the hole. The crystals left far too much space between them, and their weight caused them to rip off the wood and tumble down, half out into the sea, half down to the bottom of the hold. Tress gasped belatedly. Tress, Anne said, be careful. Moon shadows, what was she doing? The entire ship was depending on her, but she knew about as much about this as she did weaponized vexology. Watch out for that solid colored flags. They'll get you. You saw that sprouter on the Oot stream, she reminded herself. He sealed the hole. The tools were different, but you know what the patch is supposed to look like. As she fumbled with the tool, she noticed something. The roseite was still growing. When the large crystals had broken free, they left small bits attached to the hole, and those touching the water were expanding slowly like creeping mold. Did the same thing happen with verdant spores? Did the vines keep growing if you added more water? She didn't know. But she added some water to the growing roseite spores, and yes, although the growth was slow, they did continue to expand. Far too slowly to fill the hole, she thought. Still, like the proverbial politician in a dumpster, it was a good start. She took a tool that resembled the shield and pressed it to the roseite. The crystals responded immediately, pulling toward the metal, which, from the slate gray color, seemed to be simple iron. The other tool, the trowel, made the crystals grow away from it. It was polished silvery metal. Still, for those who compulsively track these things. Right, so each tool influenced the growth of spores. That made sense. Perhaps a low rumbling noise came from outside the hall. A reverberating horror, the sound of spores churning. The seed was back again. Tress, Anne shouted. No time for contemplation. If those spores flooded in, Tress would be the first to go. She took the shield tool in her left hand and pressed it into the hole. With her other hand, she grabbed a tiny pinch of 2 or 3 spores. No time to worry if her hands were dry enough, and she dropped them into the water on the rim of the broken wood. They exploded, but they were pulled to the shield, and it prevented them from going unexpected directions. The force of it did nearly shove her off the ladder. Anne cried and grabbed the base of it to steady her, which helped. As roseite crystals began to grow around the edges of the shield, Tress grabbed the trowel and pushed them away. She was able to angle them to go toward the sides of the hole, like using mortar that grew as she directed. Winds in the sail made the ship rock backward, lifting the prow. Tress barely got the crystals to seal the final edge of the hole as the ship, crashing forward, her plug stood and shook and cracked. There had been water on the other edge, but the vines that grew because of it didn't break through, and there wasn't enough water for them to grow big enough to trap the ship. The moment stretched, pulled taut with anxiety, trembling and holding its breath. The patch held. Oh, moons, Anne said. You actually did it. Can you maybe put another layer on? Or let's not tempt fate, Tress said, trying to pull her shield tool free. It was overgrown with the roseite and fixed in place. I'll probably need a silver knife to cut this off. Maybe we should try that when we're docked someplace safe. Yeah, all right, Anne said, holding the ladder as Tress climbed down. I'm just glad you were here. Until you took the job, it would have been my duty to patch that. I would have used wood, and that pause in the seethe was short enough that I wouldn't have had nearly enough time. Another crack sounded above. Gunfire. This isn't over yet, Anne said. Merciful moons, I hope that patch holds on. Come on. And that's the end of chapter 26. Chapter 27. The Spore Eater. Tress made a brief stop in her room to stow the box of spores and her remaining tool, reassuring Huck, who was hiding under the bed again, then hurried up the steps. By the time she arrived, the crow's song was getting dangerously close to their target. 3 bodies lay bleeding on the deck of the merchant ship. The rest of the crew held up their arms, no visible weapons drawn. It looked like Laggart had tried another cannon shot because another burst of vines covered the ship's aft section, many of them overgrowing the enemy's cannon. Another of Tress's swapped cannonballs had exploded instead of sinking the ship, but it might not be enough. The merchant vessel had given Crow plenty of excuses to be angry. Tress worried she would order the crew to slaughter everyone aboard that poor vessel. The pirates would have their treasure now, and Crow would have her reputation as a dead runner. As the crow's song slowed, several dogs threw hooks with ropes over the merchant vessel. Another dropped the anchor. Nervous, Tress looked to the captain, who stood with her musket at the ready. All crew, Crow said. Swords out! Prepare to board! Tress felt a sudden spike of panic. No! After all she'd done to protect those... Captain! A voice called, sharp, commanding. Everyone turned toward the quarterdeck where Sally stood, one hand on the ship's wheel. She locked it in place now that the ship was anchored, then walked to the steps. By tradition, Sally called, the duty to engage the captain of a captured ship falls to me, does it not? The Dugs kept their weapons trained on the merchant vessel, but no one spoke. They knew someone was very likely to be shot in the next few minutes and didn't want it to seem like they were volunteering. Crow turned to face Sally straight on, musket held in a loose grip. The helmswoman did not back down, and Tress found herself praying to the moons. We have subdued them, Sally said loudly. They have surrendered. We've become pirates for the freedom, nothing more. She stood firm, and her posture made her intent clear. She would not stand by and let the merchant crew be slaughtered. If Crow wanted a massacre today, she was going to have to start by killing Sally. Crow could do it, she said. Done it to Weave, but how many crew members could Crow lose and still have a functioning ship? As you say, Crow finally announced, let them know I do not appreciate the bilging my ship received after they sent up a flare of surrender. That sort of indiscretion costs lives. They'll pay more than the normal bounty, Sully said. I'll make sure of it, Captain. Tress let out a held breath. Sailors started moving again, throwing more boarding hooks to keep the ships from drifting apart. Sally was the first to hop over to the merchant ship. Tress sat down on the steps to the quarterdeck, worn out, and now feeling like a wash rag you'd find at the very bottom of the bin, the one that had been wadded up and pressed flat for weeks by the pile. A shadow fell over her. We didn't sink, Crow said. That means you did your job. Tress nodded. She was great, Captain, Anne said from behind. A natural, I'd say. Sealed that hole on her second try. Barely seemed terrified by the spores. Indeed, Crow said, her expression unreadable as she continued to look at Tress. Anne, don't you think you should be fitting planks? In case this expert work by our new sprouter isn't as durable as it might seem? I suppose. She moved off. Anne, the captain said, holding her hand out. Anne sighed and handed over a pistol she'd found somewhere, then vanished below decks. Crow moved over to watch the ship as the Dugs began appearing from its hold, bearing rolled rugs, the ship's cargo. The A group of merchant sailors huddled on deck where their captain spoke softly with Sally. He had a squeezed face with too much forehead and chin, like you were seeing it reflected in a spoon. Everyone had calmed down save one man, a sailor who knelt on the deck apart from the others. Something about his posture bothered Tress, so she climbed the steps to get a better look through the overgrown vines. Yes, the man was cradling a corpse of one of the people Crow had shot. A friend? Family member? The weeping man looked up, reckless, dangerous. Tress opened her mouth to call out a warning, but the man lurched to his feet and pulled a pistol from his belt. With a quivering hand, he pointed it across the gap between the ships toward Crow. Again, everyone froze. Everyone but Captain Crow herself. She stared down the barrel with indifference. "Schmook!" the merchant captain yelled. "Don't be a lunatic, man! You'll get us all killed!" The man, Schmoke, stood up, stained with his friend's blood, but didn't lower the gun. He also didn't pull the trigger. Captain Crow raised the pistol she'd taken offhand and pointed it at the man. Then Crow turned the pistol around and shot herself in the head. Immediately, vines erupted from Crow's skin. They split her cheek and wormed around her eyes, writhing and twisting. One caught the bullet. The skin of her face and hand rippled as if she had serpents for muscles. The vines wiggled, and then withdrew, slithering back into her body. A drop of blood leaked from the corner of Crow's eye, and a bit more seeped from a rip in her cheek, but otherwise her face appeared untouched. She lowered the pistol and then took a long pull off of her canteen. Finally, she waved Smoke forward as if demanding he try shooting her too. Several of his crew members tackled him, and then the shot went off in the air. "I expect my ship to sail under an hour," Crow said loudly, "laden with more riches than she should rightly carry." Her eyes lingered on the other ship's captain, who still stood near Sally. "If it is not done, I will visit your fine vessel and teach each and every one of you what it means to cross Captain Crow. If you doubt my sincerity, ask the crew of the Ott's Dream how much they're enjoying life at the bottom of the verdant sea." The captain disappeared into her cabin. Tress slumped onto the steps again, trembling, burdened by the terrible sight of those vines bursting from Captain Crow's body. What was she? And that's the end of the first part of chapter 4.